Today we will work on lesson 4.4a, which is operations with radical expressions. Now, let's start with the first question. What's the difference between an expression and an equation? Remember that an expression is something like 2x minus 4. That is an expression. The moment you put an equal sign to this expression and you set it equal to 0, that will become an equation. Or whenever you set it equal to a number or a variable, no matter what, as long as you have an equation, then this will make it an equation. Now let's move on to number 1. This lesson is all about simplifying radical expressions, whether by adding, subtracting, basically simplifying, multiplying radical expressions. This is what the whole lesson is going to be about. So, after knowing what an expression is and what an equation is, let's move on to number 1. In this question, you're supposed to list the steps for simplifying the expression. So, for example, in number 1, you can just disregard the parentheses because we have a plus sign. So basically, you just disregard the parentheses and try to combine like terms. Now, in the second one, since you have a negative, first of all, you have to distribute the negative to both of them, to the 4x and to the 1. Then you combine like terms. In number 1, you're supposed to FOIL. So you multiply 3x by 4x plus 1 and then negative 2 by 4x plus 1. So basically 3x, you FOIL it into 4x plus 1. That's step 1. And the next step is to FOIL or multiply negative 2 by 4x plus 1. With that said, go ahead, do those 3. Please pause the video and try those on your own. I hope you tried. Now let's move on and try to do them together. Every time you have a plus in the middle, remember, it doesn't really mean anything. The parentheses mean nothing. So you can just rewrite everything with no parentheses, with no changing any signs. Now combine like terms. As you can see that 3x and 4x, they're similar to each other, so you can combine those. 3 plus 4 is a 7, so 7x. Now let's combine the other. We have a negative 2 and a plus 1, so negative 2 plus 1 is a negative 1, and that would be your final answer. Now in the second one, where you have a negative, remember a negative changes everything inside the parentheses. So you copy 3x minus 2 as it is, and you distribute the negative to have negative 4x minus 1. Remember, a negative changes the sign of anything inside the parentheses. Now let's combine like terms. 3x minus 4x is a negative 1x. Negative 2 minus 1 is a negative 3. So you can rewrite that as negative x minus 3. That would be the final answer. Now let's move on to the last one. Distribute 3x. So 3 times 4, so I'm going to write 3x into 4x plus 1. And then distribute the negative 2, so I'm going to write negative 2 into 4x plus 1. You can just do it in your head, or you can write it down if it helps you. So this is going to be 12x squared, since 3 times 4 is a 12, and x times x is an x squared. And now let's move on. 3x times 1 is a 3x. Now let's move on to the next one. This is going to be negative 8x and negative 2. After you do that, combine like terms, so 12x squared, you copy it down. 3x minus 8x is going to be negative 5x, and you copy negative 2 down, so that would be the final answer. So this was just a review of what you do whenever you have a plus, minus, or nothing, you multiply. Now we have to do the same thing now, but whenever you have radicals. Think of radical 2 just like an x at first, and then you can simplify it. Remember, every time you multiply a radical by itself, radical 2 times radical 2 would be just 2. So the radical would just drop. So radical 2 times radical 2 equals 2. Now, I don't want you to memorize, so let me explain how you can think of this. So, if you have radical 2 times radical 2, you make the radical bigger and you multiply 2 times 2 inside the radical. So radical 2 times 2 would be radical 4. So radical 4 is just 2. Now this is how you think of it, or you can just from now on know every time you multiply a radical by itself, the radical just drops, and the answer would be 2. Now let's go ahead and try to do, so keep this in mind. Let's try to do the first one. Again, if it's a plus sign, you just disregard the parentheses. And now let's combine like terms. This is 3 radical 2 and 4 radical 2. Remember, when you add them, you add 3 plus 4 is a 7, and you copy the radical 2. Just like you would do if it were 3x plus 4x, it would be 7x. So think of radical 2 as an x. And now negative 2 plus 1 would be a negative 1, so that would be the final answer. As you can see, very similar to before. So whether you have a radical or an x, you would deal with it the same way. Now, let's move on to the next one. Again, the negative is going to change the sign, so 3 radical 2 minus 2 minus 4 radical 2 minus 1. 3 radical 2 minus 4 radical would be negative 1 radical 2. Again, just like before, 3x minus 4x would be negative 1x. 3 radical 2 minus 4 radical 2 would be negative 1 radical 2. And negative 2 minus 1 would be just negative 3, so it would be negative radical 2 minus 3. Now let's move on to the last one. Now, to multiply, you multiply 3 radical 2 by both of them, so I'm going to write that down. If it makes you comfortable, please write it down. If you can do it in your head, you can do that too. And negative 2, you multiplied by both of them, so negative 2. Let me make some room. So negative 2 into 4 radical 2 plus 1. So let's multiply this by this. So you can think of it as 3 times 4, which is at 12. And remember, every time you multiply a radical by itself, the radical would drop and you will have a 5. So radical 2 times radical 2 would be just 2. So when you multiply, you won't multiply the numbers together. 3 times 4 is a 12. And then you multiply the radicals together. Radical 2 times radical 2 is just a 2. So you write it down. 12 times 2 would be a 24. Now let's continue. Now you have to multiply 3 radical 2 by 1. So that would be plus 3 radical 2. Again, when you multiply those together, you multiply the negative 2 by the number. So negative 2 times 4 would be a negative 8. And you just copy the radical 2 down. So again, negative 2 times 4 radical 2 would give you negative 8 radical 2. And then you multiply the negative 2 by 1, you would get a negative 2. Now 12 times 2 is a 24. 3 radical 2 minus 8 radical 2. 3 minus 8 would be a negative 5. And you copy the radical 2. And then you move the negative 2 down. Now 24 minus 2 would give you 22 minus 5 radical 2. And that would be the final answer. Now it's time to page. Go ahead, do those 3 on your own. Pause the video. Take 10 minutes, take your time, work on your own, then check your answers with the group, and then play the video again. Now, every time you have a plus, you can disregard the parentheses, so you can write that down. Combine like terms. So this has a radical 3, this has a radical 2. They are not alike, so you just copy them down. You cannot combine them if they have different radicals. Think of it as being 3y and, like, for example, 4x. You cannot combine those two. These are separate. It's the same concept. Negative 2 plus 1 is a negative 1, so that would be your final answer. Now, negative, you distribute the negative, so it would be negative 4 radical 2 and negative 1. Again, let's combine like terms. This is all alone. This is all alone. You cannot combine those two because they are different radicals. Negative 2 minus 1 would be a negative 3, and that would be your final answer. Now, when you multiply, remember you can multiply 3 radical 6 by 4 radical 2 plus 1. And then negative 2 by, let's make some room. Negative 2 times 4 radical 2 plus 1. Now, remember, when you multiply it, you multiply the numbers together. So 3 times 4 is a 12. And then you multiply radical 6 by radical 2. Now, radical 6 times radical 2 is a radical 12. Now 3 radical 6 times 1 would be 3 radical 6. So 3 times 4 is a 12. And radical 6 times radical 2, I'm going to write it on the side to show you. Radical 6 times radical 2. You make the radical bigger and you multiply 6 and 2 under the radical, so that would give you radical 12. So that's where the radical 12 came from. Now again, when you multiply 3 radical 6 by 1, it would be the same. Now negative 2. Negative 2 times 4 would be a negative 8, and you copy the radical 2 down, and then negative 2 times 1 would be just negative 2. Now let's try to combine like terms. So 12 radical 2, just copy it down. This and this are separate, so also copy it down. As you can see, there's nothing you can do but wait. Look at the 12. The 12 is 4 times 3. And the 4 is 2 times 2. So the prime numbers are 2 times 2 times 3. Now remember, if there's the index, there's no index, you can assume it's 2. So every time you have a group of 2, they will leave the radical. So this is a group of 2, so it will leave the radical. There were already 12 outside. Don't forget to multiply it by 2. And then what's going to be left is 3 under the radical. So it would be just radical 3. Now 6 is 3 times 2. So there's no double of any, so it stays as it is. Minus 8 radical 2 minus 2. So basically it would be 12 times 2 would be 24 radical 3 plus 3 radical 6 minus 8 radical 2 minus 2. You cannot combine any of those radicals since each one is different. Now let's move on. If you want, take your time, review this, and make sure that you understand it. Now let's move on. If you want, you can pause the video and do it again. Now, those numbers from here up till here, they're all about simplifying radicals like we did in the previous number where you had radical 12. Now, so in order to simplify, let's see. Now, since they have the same radical, you can combine them. So 3 minus 4 is a negative 1. Radical 6, which means it's a negative radical 6. Now here, as you can see, 54 is really big, so you can do the tree. So it's 2 times 27, and then 27 is 9 times 3, and 9 is 3 times 3. So 54 basically is 2 times 3 times 3 times 3. Now there's no index, so you can assume that the index is 2. So whenever you have a group of 2, they leave the radical. So these leave the radical. So you already have a 3 outside, so you put 3. This 3, you copy it down. And now radical 54 would be this, so 3. And those stay inside the parentheses, so 2 times 3 is a 6. So copy negative 4 radical 6. Let me make some room to continue. So 3 times 3 would be a 9 radical 6. Copy the negative 4 radical 6. So 9 radical 6 minus 4 radical 6 would give you 5 radical 6. So every time you simplify, whatever is inside the radical, whatever goes out should multiply by the number that's outside. Just like we did over here, 54. There is a group of 3. Group of 2. So this 3 leaves the radical, so you multiply it by the 3 that's already outside. The 2 is all alone, the 3 is all alone, they stay inside the radical. So let's move on to number 5. It would be a good time to pause the video and do the rest of those. Take 10 to 15 minutes and then play the video to watch those. I hope you took your time. Now let's do this one. 8 is 4 times 2, and 4 is 2 times 2, so you can see that 8 is 2 times 2 times 2, so those 3. The index over here is 2, so groups of 2 would leave the building, let's say. So we have those 2, because there's a 2 over here, so this will leave the building, and this would stay inside the radical. So there is already a 5, don't forget to copy it down, times whatever radical 8 is. Now, square root of 8 is 2, since we have this, and the radical 2, this stays inside the radical, plus 3 radical 2. So 5 times 2 is a 10 radical 2 plus 3 radical 2. And since they are like terms, you can combine them to get 13 radical 2. Now let's move on to this one. 20 is 5 times 4, and 4 is 2 times 2. So again, the index so far has been a 2. So anything that's in groups of 2, they leave the building. So those leave, and this stays. So it's radical 20 then is 2 radical 5, and don't forget to copy this 2 down, so 2 times whatever radical 20 is, minus 3 radical 2. You cannot simplify this anymore, so 45, let's simplify that. It's 9 times 5, and 9 is 3 times 3, so circle all of those. Again, the index is 2, so anything that's in groups of 2 would leave, so these will leave the building, and this will stay. So it's going to be minus 3 radical 5. There's no number over here to multiply it by, so it's just 3 radical 5. Now 2 times 2 is a 4 radical 5 minus 3 radical 2 minus 3 radical 5. Now 4 radical 5 minus 3 radical 5 would be 1 radical 5 minus 3 radical 2, which is a radical 5 minus 3 radical 2. And that would be it. Let's move on to the next one. Oh, I didn't see that. So let's do this one. 50 is 5 times 10. And 10 is 5 times 2. So again, the index is 2, so anything in groups of 2 would leave. So the 5 will leave, and this will stay inside the radical. So 3, don't forget to copy it. 5 radical 2 plus 5. 8 is again 4 times 2, which is 2 times 2. These will leave, and this will stay. So it's going to be 5 times 2 radical 2. 3 times 5 is 15 radical 2 plus 10 radical 2, and that would give you 25 radical 2. Now let's move on to the last one. Now remember, we did radical 4 before, radical 54, I think. We did something that has to do with radical 54, so there you go. Radical 54, we found it to be 3 radical 6, so you don't have to do it again. So radical 54, I'm going to write it on the side, is 3 radical 6. And the 45 is something that we did earlier as well. So 45 is 3 radical 5, so I'm going to write it down. And square root of 45 is 3 radical 5. So let's see how we can use that. Now copy the 5 down. Copy the 5 down. Radical 45 is 3 radical 5, so multiplied by 3 radical 5. Negative 3. And then radical 54 is 3 radical 6, so multiplied by 3 radical 6. Now 5 times 3 is 15 radical 5, minus 3 times 3 is 9 radical 6. So that would be the final answer, since you cannot combine radical 5 and radical 6. Now, how can you do that using a calculator? What you can do is on your calculator you can, for example, put 3 radical 6 minus 4 radical 6, write it as it is, and then find what it would be, and then find negative radical 6 also and look at it in decimal form, and then compare them if they are the same. You can do that. So also you can do the same thing for this. You can type in 3 radical 50 plus 5 radical 8 and find it in decimal form, and you could type 25 radical 2 also in decimal form, and you can see if they give you the same answer. So I hope you understand this. I'm gonna be posting the notes complete, and the practice sheet will be due for grades on Friday. So make sure that you review this very well, and if you need to watch it again at home, please do so.